chapter 13. And there's a reason why it is chapter 13, because there are just things in it that goes against the grain of folks. Goes against my grain. There's a lot of things in here I don't like, but yet here it is. And when it comes to Scripture, you just say, "Well, Lord, I don't really care for that, but I'll do it anyway." And we're going to be talking about that. Excuse me, I can't clear my throat tonight. We only got down to we only did 4 verses, so I'm just going to read starting at verse 1, then we'll pick it up in verse 5. It says, "Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, the powers that be ordained of God." And I've made this, I've told you this before, that God didn't make any power evil. Now, they may have turned evil, they may have chosen to do evil, but He didn't make anything evil. So you can't say that God made evil power. No, He made powers, and then they decided to do evil, like Lucifer, like the angels, the fallen angels, like man. So you can't blame that on God. He made everything sinless when He made it. But do they still have power? Yes, they still have power. This is not over with yet, but that power is of God. Why? Because He made it originally. "Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation." That is, God sets up government and power. And you are not to resist that power. You're to follow that power. Now, we've already talked about higher authority. If you understand that, none of this will contradict in your mind. You're always obeying the highest authority. If God tells you one thing and man tells you something else, then like Peter, you say to that authority, "We ought to obey God rather than men." And on down the road you go. Now, that's not saying they won't take you and beat you, because that's exactly what they did. Everybody thinks, well, I can disobey the authority. Yeah, but the authority's going to come after you, because they don't respect what God says, and therefore they may beat you. But the plus side of that is you just got beaten for doing what God told you to do. That's not bad. You're chosen to suffer for His name's sake. Verse 3, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil." That is, God didn't set up the law to punish people that are doing good, doing right. He set up the law to punish those that are evildoers. It says, "Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same." And then verse 4, it says, "For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." And that is the purpose of government. That is the purpose of the law. And that is what? Vengeance and execute wrath. Rehabilitation's not in there. We said we need to really rehabilitate these people. I can tell you how to rehabilitate them. Beat them. When I went back to the Old Testament, you can find where they could hold somebody in ward, but you don't find prisons in your Old Testament. Now, there might be some in Egypt. There might be some someplace else, but in Israel, there wasn't any. They could hold them in ward for a time. But either one of 3 things happened. They killed them, capital punishment. They fined them heavily, or they beat them. And sometimes they'd beat them and fine them. But if we reduced it to those 3 things, it's either a punishable by death offense, punishable by a beating, or punishable by a heavy fine. We wouldn't have to build any prisons. We wouldn't have to worry about murderers and rapists. They would be dead. Okay? All we got to do is just dig a hole in the ground, throw them in it. Now you say, "Oh, that just sounds so barbaric." I guarantee you people will straighten up real quick. You won't have gotten through several, probably in this country, it might take several thousand, but it wouldn't take very long before people straightened up. I mean, if you know you're going to get a beating, I'm telling you now, that's persuasive. I mean, now we give them 3 meals a day. We provide them a lawyer, health care, TV. Yeah, they got. I can see the TVs from where I'm preaching, and they're watching pretty much what they want to watch. And they're all talking about this program and that program, and health care, and I just look at them and said, man, I need to get in here. So, yeah, it's free. All right, verse 5. This is where we're going to pick it up. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. So there's 2 reasons why you're told to obey the powers that be. One is wrath, and that is the government has the power to punish you. Why? God gave them the power. Okay? Now, obviously, this can go awry, and when it goes awry is because of a sinful people. Usually we get what we deserve. Yeah, I know. It's terrible, isn't it? This nation is getting what it deserves. You better hope it doesn't get it again for 4 more years. Because that'll be the end of the nation. I'm convinced of that. And I'm not trying to persuade anybody politically. I'm just telling you, if it goes on like this, and it would not be beyond my imagination that we could continue on for 4 more years with a shadow government, because obviously the president's not able to do it. I mean, am I speaking out of turn? Am I speaking the truth? Not trying to speak evil. I mean, I'm just telling you, he can't. So what's going to happen? Well, I can tell you it's going to be bad news. Anyway, moving on. He said, for wrath's sake, the government has the power to punish you. And then he says, for conscience. Violating law is not just an offense to men, but to God. Look at Acts chapter 24. Look at verse 16. Acts 24:16. Next time you're speeding going on down the road, just remember it's sin. It's not just an offense that man can pull you over and fine you and give you a ticket. But it's also the fact that you have violated the powers that be for conscience sake. There's been probably a few preachers that I can think of one. I'm not going to mention his name, but they said he just fly. He just fly down the road, and I don't know how reckless he was. I don't know how many tickets he had, but even that is a bad testimony. Oh yeah, I got to go to traffic court again because he caught me, doing 50 and a 20. It shouldn't be that way. And I hate getting a ticket worse than anything. And if I do, I feel bad for days after I get one. I think the last time I had one's probably been 15, 20 years ago, probably. And I'm telling you, I made up my mind then. You said you obey the laws that be, and I try to. Every now and then I'll catch myself. You're doing that. You're not paying attention. I ran right through a stop sign. There's a place right for me that there wasn't a stop sign there for 30 years, and now there is. And you're just going along and not thinking about anything. Next thing you know, I blew right through it. I looked, and the highway patrol station was just down the road, and I said, there'll be somebody sitting there. There wasn't. But, I mean, things like that happen. If they'd have caught me, well, I violated the law, but, that was just an accident, but I didn't do it on purpose. Now, it's a good thing nothing else is coming because they'd have plowed right into me. Anyway, he said there in Acts 24:16, and herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. That's what you ought to work toward. It just you're not violating, you're not offending men, and you're not offending God. Okay? Now, we're not talking about preaching the gospel. We're not talking about prayer. We're not talking about church. We're talking about obeying the laws that be that govern our cities and things. And I'll tell you what, it gets very intrusive. But it wouldn't be intrusive if people loved their neighbor. You wouldn't even need them, would you? And that's what we see down through here. You want to know why you got laws that you can't even build a doghouse in your backyard without getting it approved? I'll tell you why. Because somebody else did something that they shouldn't have done and built it. And my wife showed me this video. And this guy, man, he was cussing mad. And he had a fence, solid wood fence, laying down right next to his driveway. His neighbor had taken a chainsaw and just ring, 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 and just dropped it. He did something else too, did a couple other things. And go ahead. Yeah. He said, you're on my property. They had a survey done. This guy was well within his property, like by 3 or 4 feet. And he said, you're going to jail for felony vandalism. I got a feeling his neighbor wasn't going to say, well, I forgive you. I don't think he was a Christian. But that's, we have laws because people do build fences on other people's property. They do encroach, or they do something stupid like that, and you've got laws to protect you. And anyway, Paul had to bite his tongue a time or two. He says this, wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. But Paul got slapped upside the mouth by Ananias, the high priest, and then he said, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. He pretty much cursed him. And they said, they said to him, revilest thou God's high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest. Yeah, he lied just as sure as you live and breathe. You're going to tell me the Apostle Paul didn't know who the high priest was? A Pharisee of Pharisees? And he didn't know who the high priest was? I think Ananias might have been there when they condemned Stephen. Yeah. That's what I'd have pled. I'm blind. But you know what happened when one of them reached over there and Jack slapped old Paul or backhanded old Paul across the face. Man, that old flesh did immediately responded. Have you been there? Have you been there? And wish you could have just called that back. Okay, but he says we need to be subject to it, and as bad as you might hate some of the laws, you're subject to them. Nothing you can do about it. You might as well just obey them and behave. Verse 6, it says, "For this cause pay ye tribute also." Now, not only do I got to obey the laws, now I got to pay for them. And for this cause pay ye tribute also. That's taxes. For they are God's ministers. Uh-oh. That bunch we got up in Washington is God's ministers? Man, what has happened? It says, attending continually upon this thing. We're going to take those 3 phrases and look at them. The first one, for this cause pay ye tribute also. Pay taxes to support them. Nobody wants to pay taxes. At least I've never met anybody that wanted to pay them. If they require you to pay, and usually they do, God says pay it. Now turn to Matthew chapter 17, and the Lord puts his money where his mouth is. In other words, God didn't tell you to do anything that he wouldn't do. And if the Lord will pay that bunch, well then, looks like you're stuck too. Matthew 17, look at verse 24. And when they were come, Matthew 17, 24, let y'all get there. And when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money, that'd be them tax collectors, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? He saith, yes. And when he was coming to the house, Jesus prevented him. You know when you try to walk into a door and somebody just steps right in front of you? Huh? You're probably like, what? He goes, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Well, if you're in the United States, it's of children. I mean, we should be, every nation we ever conquered, we should have taxed them. We should have taken their oil. We should have taken their goods in payment because we have to pay for these wars if you win. If you're the winner, you got to pay for the loser. Did y'all know that? Bankers don't lose out on wars. If Germany lost, guess what? We had to pay Germany's debt. If Japan lost, we had to pay for their debt. So you know what you do? You take what they have. You take tribute from them. Nebuchadnezzar, man, he made everybody pay tribute to him. I guarantee you the Persian king, Cyrus and Artaxerxes and all them guys, Darius, I guarantee you, man, they took tribute from every nation they conquered. Only the United States is foolish enough to think that we can, well, look how far we're in debt. You know, if you're gonna kill your young men on the battlefield, at least get something for it, or don't fight. There's no sense in fighting if there's nothing to gain by it. Verse 26, Peter saith unto him, of strangers, Jesus saith unto him, then are the children free. Well, was Jesus a child of God? Was he a son of Israel? Yeah. He's free. So was Peter. But look what he says here. See, it doesn't matter whether you're right or not. It doesn't matter whether you think you shouldn't have to pay taxes or not. It doesn't matter what you think the Constitution says. They send you a tax bill. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, cast a hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give it unto them for me and thee. Jesus Christ was paying taxes to Caesar. Jesus Christ, the creator of the world, was paying taxes to Caesar. You cannot be an anti-tax person when the Son of God is paying taxes to Caesar. So this makes the anti-tax movement ungodly and satanic. And you'll go to jail and you'll lose your testimony. Do we know someone like that? Afraid so. Know of a few that went to jail over that. You know what? That is not money. Money is not worth going to jail over. It's not. Pay your taxes. He says there that for this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers. In other words, they're there for a purpose and they perform a service, and you're going to pay them for that service. Now, I rarely, I mean, probably the only time a meat wagon is going to pull up to my house is to haul away my dead body. I will crawl to the hospital before I'll call an ambulance or the life squad or anything like. I just don't want to involve them. I don't want them involved in my life. That's how I feel about it. Some people, they don't. I mean, they're calling them every other week and they're pulling up, hauling you off, you know, and that's fine. And I realize I got to pay for all that. I just don't want to be involved in all that. I don't want them involved in my life. Now, sometimes the Lord forces me into that situation because He's going to prove to me that no matter where I'm at, He's there too. And I had to learn that because I thought I could just stay away, you know. And the older I get, that's probably not going to be possible either if the Lord tarries. Anyway, I don't know why I said all that. But they've got a purpose and they perform a service. In the Old Testament, the priests were supported by the tithe. And they had a purpose and they performed a service. And he said in Malachi 3:10, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. Well, God ain't eating it. What's He need with meat in His house? Well, that's to feed all the priests and the Levites that are performing the service. He says, and prove me now therewith, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will open you up the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that ye shall not, and there shall not be room enough to receive it. In other words, he said, look, if you obey me and do this, and tithing was under the law. I do not believe that we're under the law in the church age to tithe, but I believe in tithing. I believe it is fundamental that we give back to God of our riches. Numbers 18:24 says, but the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as a heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. The tithe was their inheritance. And listen, if you don't tithe in the New Testament under the church age, if you don't tithe in this age, you don't go to hell, do you? No. I mean, he said, he cursed them for not tithing over there in Malachi chapter 3. He says, ye are cursed with a curse. All right? That doesn't happen to the child of God, but what does happen is they that sow sparingly shall what? Reap sparingly. So you have the Old Testament priests who are supported by the tithe. You have New Testament ministers are supported by free will offerings, because that's what Christians do. They freely give. Nobody's making anybody give. I mean, you don't have the threat. Now, let's put it this way. I'm afraid not to, because I want God in my finances. I don't want him to ignore my finances. That could be detrimental. But in 1 Corinthians 9:14, it says, even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. In other words, there are ministers that have a purpose and perform a service. And it's only right to support them and take care of them. But then you have the powers that be that are in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And guess what? They have the power to collect tribute money to support them. What's surprising is Solomon, when he was king, it gives a list over there of how many animals were slain in one day for his table. I mean, all the people that he was feeding every day. I mean, he had horses in abundance. In fact, he had too many. He accepted horses from Egypt he wasn't supposed to. He had so much gold, he had too much. He had silver, so much silver that it was like, it was worth no more than rocks. That's bad. You know, you can have too much of something that's good, and then it's bad by itself. He had so much of that it wasn't worth anything. But anyway, they're able to take people to support. A king can. He can take people. He says, oh, I need this guy. And next thing you know, he's no longer working on your farm. He's working for the king. Maybe he's shoeing his horses or something, or taking care of his stalls, or cooking his meals. But that's what they do. And they have the power to do that. Now, our situation is a little different. We just hire them, and then we have to pay their salaries. But then he says they are God's ministers attending upon this very thing. Well, what is it that they're attending to? Well, they're attending to the rule of law, because that's their purpose. And in verse 4, he mentions it there. He says, for he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is a minister of God, a revenger. A revenger. He is there to take vengeance on those that do evil. And it says, and to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. I mean, they're there to make sure the sword falls. That's God's purpose. I don't know how any Christian comes to the conclusion that capital punishment is evil. Capital punishment is not only before the law, but during the law and after the law. Paul said, if I've done anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. And it says, kill me. In the Old Testament, there's a whole list of things that you could receive capital punishment for. I mean, they killed a fellow for picking up sticks on Saturday. Under God's theocracy, man, do you know what happened when somebody ate of a tree they weren't supposed to? The whole human race fell. God's serious about keeping the law. So you do the best you can. Now, what happens when the government says, hey, you guys can't pray anymore and you can't meet? We're going to meet, we're going to pray. Why? Because God told us to. And that just overrides them completely. Always stay in obedience. Verse 7. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. All right, look at Luke chapter 20. Luke chapter 20, look at verse 22 to 25. Some real smart aleck, was asking the Lord these questions, trying to trap him. And they said, is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar? Because under the Old Testament law, they were not to take to themselves a Gentile king. But they already had, right? They were conquered and subjected to it because of their sin. But he says there, is it law for us to give tribute unto Caesar or no? But he perceived their craftiness and said unto them, why tempt ye me? Show me a penny. By the way, a penny back then, or a penny here, would have been a day's wages, right? He said, I'll pay you a penny for a day's wages. A penny was a silver coin. Trying to think of the name they called it. I can't think of it. Anyway, it looked about the size of a dime, but it was silver, about a little bit fatter than a dime, and that was a day's wages. You can still find them on the internet. You can still buy one from England, where a penny is a silver coin. And there was a day when that was a day's wages. I can't remember the name in the new Bibles they always want to call it something else, But all you have to do is just use your common sense. A penny to us is something that's, now it's made of zinc, 95% zinc. It used to be made of copper. Copper's nearly $5 a pound now. That's a good indication your economy's it's tanking when copper goes up. And it's nearly $5 a pound. Just want to give you some more good news tonight. Anyway, he says, show me a penny. Whose image and superscription hath it? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said unto them, render. Notice, render. Doesn't he say, render therefore to all their dues? Render therefore unto Caesar the things which be Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God's. There you are. I mean, you're stuck with it. And you might as well just accept it. Then he mentions their dues. Okay? Tribute, that's taxes. Now, anybody can think that, our Constitution does not spell out. They're going to tax you, and you have to pay it. And there's people that have challenged it in court. I always hear, they challenge them in court, they beat them every time. I don't think so. I've heard that, but I've never met the man or seen the man that's escaped not paying his taxes. Now, maybe there's somebody out there that has. All the power to them. Yeah. Or they spend time in jail paying their debt, and then we get to take care of them while they're in jail, Tax or tribute is taxes. Custom. Custom is an accepted way of behaving or doing something in your society. That's a custom. You go anywhere, there's certain customs. And as long as it's not against the Bible, custom to whom custom is due. I mean, if you're to dress a certain way or to present now I'm not going naked, obviously, that wouldn't be right. But if you have to dress a certain way or there's some certain custom that they expect that you'll do, it's not against the Bible, do it. Fear. God has given them the power, better stay on the right side of it. That's why he does talk about fear. Well, I thought we weren't supposed to fear anybody but God. Yeah, but there's no power but of God. God gave them the very power, and you're to fear that power. And then he says, honor. And this is where even when they don't deserve it, and most of them don't, at least today they don't, even when they don't deserve it, you honor the office. That's why I know how it is. You just, that vitriol is right on the tip of your tongue, man. You just want to lay into them. But you got to be careful. Why? That power's of God. No matter how evil it is. And you see that back in the Old Testament, how many of those Jews behaved themselves before those emperors and those kings. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, type of the Antichrist. I mean, they're bowing before him. They're subject to him. I mean, Daniel, he practically running those kingdoms. I mean, we're talking about through the Persian Empire. He stays in good with them, but yet he's still not compromising. He did make one little, well, it wasn't a little mistake, but for the most part, he is still obeying God, even though it nearly cost him his life, but God got him out of it when they threw him in the lion's den. In other words, unless unless they're telling you to disobey God, you obey. That's all there is to it. So honor the office when you can't honor the man. 2 Peter 2:10 says, but chiefly them that walk after the flesh and the lust of uncleanness and despise government. Watch out. Presumptuous are they, self-willed they are, not afraid to speak evil of dignities. Jude verse 8, 1 verse 8. Likewise also these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities. When your Bible telling you there's no power but of God. Bad thing about it is the Antichrist is coming. And you know who gives him his power? I mean, you say what comes from the dragon, but who gives the dragon his power? God does. There is no power but of God. So you say they're to obey the Antichrist right up until the time he tells them to take a mark. I don't know. I don't know how you get around all that stuff. I don't want to be in that kind of. Listen, we live in a country where if you just obey the simple laws of the land and do right, you don't have any problem. We've never had a problem here, but we're not trying to do anything shady. We try to stay above board in everything we do here. Why? Because we don't want any trouble with the government. I mean, I decided when we first, actually, I didn't decide it. It was decided for us when this church began that we were going to get a 501c3. I have never had the government contact me about anything in 18 years. Not one single thing. So, but you say, what happens? Well, when you want to have a daycare and a hospital and you want to have some type of money-making operation out of your church, guess who's going to get involved? The government's going to get involved. And it's probably because some lying, cheating preacher that was cheating the government out of tax money because he was, skimming it and putting it in the church, and they found out about it. That's why you got the laws. Anytime you're doing something like that, you are outside of what this Bible says. Even when you have a church building and land outside of the New Testament, and there could be complications because of it. You just have to kind of roll with it, kind of pray about it. Anyway, now talking about, you said, well, this country was founded on rebellion against England. Yes, it was. The founding fathers of the United States were willing to fight for what they believed in, and they did. They also were willing to lose everything they had for it, and most did. If you're not willing to endure either one of these things, I would keep quiet and behave. Now, I've got down here the U.S. is a rebellious colony, but we did not try to overthrow King George. We didn't try to kill the king. We just tried to overthrow his dominion over these colonies. Okay? And something else, this is not an excuse, this is just something that happened. Before Patrick Henry made his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, he witnessed a street preacher being beaten to death by British soldiers. I can have an impact on you. The number 13 is all over our flag, our money, our government, and 13 is the number of rebellion in the Bible. In Genesis 14:4, it says, 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And I mean, America is just piled up with 13s. I think there are probably 13 13s on that dollar bill of yours. I mean, it's just 13 stars, 13 stripes, 13 colony. I mean, it's bad. But you do realize that this experiment as a republic will be short-lived compared to empires that have been around for millennia. We are an experiment that is not going to be around that long. A republic is to follow the rule of law, the Constitution. And that's the very thing being ignored by the lawmakers. John Adams said this. He was the second president. He said, our Constitution was designed for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So the Constitution has not been the sole law of the land since 1865. That's when Abraham Lincoln centralized power to the federal government. And from that point, slowly, a degrading is taking place, and our Constitution is now being completely ignored. Your rights are being completely ignored. So, experiment over. Why? We're not a moral people, and we're certainly not a religious, Bible-believing people anymore. At one time we were. At one time you could rely on your neighbor. At one time you got along with your neighbor. Not anymore. All right, now the worst verse in the Bible. Owe no man anything. The most violated commandment in the entire Bible. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. In 2003, the debt of this country was $3 trillion. And we thought, we'll never recover from that. In 2024, as of this month, it is $34 trillion. $34 trillion. And I think it's going to reach $50 trillion here in in no time flat. I think it's $1 trillion every 6 months now. I don't know if you know what $1 trillion is. That's a whole lot of money. That's a million billions. $34 trillion calculates into $97,000 of debt per man, woman, and child based on 350 million people. And it may be a little bit more than that in the United States now. But 97,000, that means for every kid you got, you're $100,000 more in debt. And if you got a whole carload of them, man, you could be $1 million in debt. Credit card debt. 1.2 trillion in credit card debt in 2024. That is the average of $21,083 per household. God help us. He said, owe no man anything. Now I understand I owe on a house. Okay? I'm not going to tell you that's necessarily right. I know that's how we acquire homes. We get mortgages. And somebody say, well, as long as you're paying that monthly payment, then you don't owe. Okay. I don't know about that. But I'll say this. Other debt where you owe people, a lot of people are, they'll owe $20,000 on a credit card and they just default on it. I don't understand that. They just default on it and say, no, I'm just going to declare bankruptcy. And they make the people they owe eat the cost of that, or they make the credit card company eat the cost, which they in turn raise your rates. It's not right. The only debt that is acceptable, yes, there is one debt. And what's that? To love one another. That's what it says. It says, owe no man anything. I told you it's going to be it's a rough passage. Owe no man anything but to love one another. In John 15:12, this is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. 1 John 4:11, beloved, if God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. Why? Love fulfills the law. Because you do not offend those you love. If you can imagine in eternity people everybody loving one another, and I'm talking about real love, there would never be an offense. It would be the most horrible thing to you that you would offend someone, so you never would. You don't need any laws. There's no laws in eternity for heaven. Why would you have laws? Because people love one another, they wouldn't have to worry about offending somebody. Does that make sense? Okay. It says, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. And then he says in verse 9, for this, here we go, thou shalt not commit adultery. If you loved your neighbor, would you steal his spouse? Or her spouse? Not if you loved your neighbor. Thou shalt not kill. You wouldn't kill your neighbor, would you? Not if you loved him. How about thou shalt not steal? You wouldn't steal his stuff? Wait till he's gone and sneak over there and take his stuff? Thou shalt not bear false witness. You wouldn't lie about him in court, would you? Not if you loved him. You can see how the problem we've got is a love problem. People don't love one another, so they don't care. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. You're not going to want somebody's stuff that doesn't belong to you. Not if you love them. And if there be any other commandment, doesn't matter what it is briefly comprehended in this saying, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, you wouldn't want it done to you, so you wouldn't do it to them. It's kind of like the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You love it. You love your neighbor as yourself. And how you would want to be treated, and that would be ironclad with you. So the thing to do about your neighbor is show them more grace than they've ever showed you. Because you can have some real neighbors. I know. Let me tell you something. I think God beat me with them just because I wouldn't come around. Okay? I mean, I had to learn it the hard way to just let it go. Be good to your neighbors, even when they're not good to you. And when they trespass against you, forgive them and go on. That's hard to do, man, I'm telling you. At least it was hard for me. But I kept coming back. I said, this is never going to end. This is never going to end. And God's saying, yeah, as long as you keep behaving like you're behaving, this is never going to end. And I finally got it. I just said, oh, okay. So I just got to the point. I mean, like I said, I found beer bottles in the yard when I was mowing, and they weren't cans. They were bottles. So if I'd hit them with a mower, it'd have thrown glass everywhere. He said, what do you do? I got off the mower, picked them up, put them on the mower with me, mowed the lawn, threw them away. Never said a word. Not one word to them. I could have called over there and said, what do you think you're doing? Throwing beer bottles in my yard. I could have called the law, got them for, I don't think anybody else could have thrown a half mile from the street. So I didn't do anything. Why? Because I'm supposed to love my neighbor. Anyway. Verse 10, and here it is. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Now, obviously, if your neighbor does something that's that criminal, okay, you're going to have to call the law. I mean, if they break into your house or they assault your wife or something like that, obviously you got to call the police. I'm talking about you know what I'm talking about, those things that just irritate the devil out of you and punch your buttons. Those are the things you need to just overlook and be done with it and not make a big fuss about it. Have some grace about you. So you don't violate the ones you love. You don't do things to hurt them. So the standard is love thy neighbor as thyself. That's hard to do. It just is. James 2:8 says, if ye fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well. Okay? So now I know you're to love God first, and I think it takes that in consideration. It's just saying, look, if you're going to get along with folks, love your neighbor as yourself. That's all you got to do. And if you'll do that, you'll never offend. And if you did happen to offend even by accident, you would be conciliatory. You would be sorry about it. You would apologize for it. You might even allow yourself to be defrauded. You know that standard right there came out of the Old Testament. That's Leviticus 19:18. We'll look at that and then we'll be done. hadn't changed. Wasn't there a New Testament? No, this is it. Leviticus 19, verse 18. Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There it is. I am the Lord. So under the Old Testament, love thy neighbor as thyself. Under the New Testament, love thy neighbor as thyself. In the tribulation, because it's found in James, love thy neighbor as thyself. Or is that Peter? It might have been in 1 Peter, 2 Peter. No, I had it somewhere in there. James 2:8, yeah. James 2:8, I was right. Well, James 2:8 is a tribulation epistle. It never changed. Love thy neighbor as thyself. That's conduct. Now, not talking about anything about salvation here. We're talking about people living with other people and getting along. Okay? It only took me 20 years to learn that. So, all right. That's enough for tonight. Anybody got a question or comment? That's what you got out of my lesson.